What if everything you believed about Meghan Markle's most vulnerable moment was a lie? Not just a misunderstanding, not a misstatement, but a meticulously crafted, globally distributed deception, written in ink and grief, and published on one of the world's most prestigious platforms. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And what if the person who could no longer stay silent wasn't a journalist, or a whistleblower, or a member of the royal family, but Meghan's own mother? Yes, Doria Ragland. The ever-composed, quietly loyal, yoga-teaching, crystal-wearing maternal figure who always stood silently in the background, behind the veil of her daughter's image, has allegedly spoken. And what she said changes everything. Let that sink in. Because this isn't just another Meghan Markle PR twist. This isn't about fashion choices, royal protocols, or Spotify deals. This is about the heart of a woman's identity and the weaponization of motherhood, pain, and public sympathy. The world remembers that op-ed, November 25, 2020, titled simply, "The Losses We Share," a heartbreakingly personal piece published in the New York Times, where Meghan shared, in delicate, poignant prose, her experience of suffering a miscarriage in July that year. She described the moment, changing Archie's diaper, feeling a sharp cramp, and falling to the floor. She wrote, "I knew, as I clutched my firstborn child, that I was losing my second." It was raw, emotional, intimate, and it worked. Media outlets around the globe rallied. Feminists applauded her bravery. The public offered condolences. And quietly, very quietly, questions stopped. Because who dares interrogate a grieving mother? But what if the grief was staged? What if the heartbreak was premeditated? And what if Doria Ragland, the one person who knew Meghan before the fame, before the palaces, before the reinventions, has finally had enough? You see, something happened behind the scenes. Something strange. Something even Meghan's slickest PR team couldn't smooth over. It wasn't what Doria did, but what she didn't do. She didn't speak. She didn't support. She didn't post. She didn't appear. While the world rallied around Meghan's tragedy, Doria disappeared. And now, years later, the truth behind that silence might finally be cracking wide open. But why would Meghan lie? What would she gain from fabricating such a deeply personal trauma? Let's rewind the tape. July 2020. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry were living in Montecito, California, after their dramatic exit from royal life. Their popularity was plummeting in the UK. US tabloids were beginning to question their brand. The pandemic had pushed them into physical and emotional isolation. Their Spotify and Netflix deals weren't bearing fruit. Public sympathy was waning. Then suddenly, months later, in November, they drop a bombshell narrative. A miscarriage, told not through Instagram, not via a royal spokesperson, but in an op-ed in the New York Times, a vehicle carefully chosen for maximum credibility, international reach, and emotional weight. Coincidence? Or strategy? Now here's the kicker. There was no formal medical report, no public hospital acknowledgement, no third-party verification, just a vivid personal story, typed on a keyboard, distributed as gospel. And it worked. The narrative shifted. Meghan went from celebrity to victim, from royal rebel to grieving mother, from criticized to canonized. But something didn't add up. Something small, something subtle, a missing puzzle piece. Where was Doria? Where was the loving, hands-on grandmother who had been there for Archie's birth, who stood alone at the royal wedding, who was said to be Meghan's emotional rock? Why was she completely absent, visibly, vocally, and emotionally, during what should have been the most devastating moment of her daughter's life? People began to whisper. But it wasn't until recently, when rumors emerged that Doria had privately expressed doubts, that the narrative began to crack. Allegedly, Doria confided to a close friend that Meghan never told her about being pregnant in July 2020, that she found out after the op-ed was published. Just like the rest of the world. According to that source, Doria was blindsided, confused, and quietly furious, not just at being left out, but at being used. Because if Meghan wasn't truly pregnant, then what exactly was she mourning? And why had Doria, her mother, been kept in the dark? This is where it gets even messier. In the months that followed the op-ed, Meghan's team ramped up their visibility. A Netflix deal was announced. Harry began penning his memoir, Spare. Archewell launched initiatives centered on compassion, women's trauma, and mental health. The sympathy campaign had begun, but Doria's presence faded further and further into the background. Insiders say she grew increasingly disillusioned, that her trust in her daughter began to erode, and that she kept quiet until now. Now, multiple sources allege Doria has broken that silence. Not in a press conference, not in an Instagram post, but in a series of off-the-record conversations that have quietly begun to circulate. And the content? Damning. We're talking about private doubts, confessions that Meghan may have fabricated her miscarriage for sympathy, accusations that the NYT op-ed was pre-written by PR handlers, claims that Doria herself was pressured to support a story she didn't believe. It's explosive, and if proven true, it would mean Meghan Markle didn't just manipulate the media. She emotionally manipulated the world. Let's pause here. Ask yourself, how does it feel to imagine a daughter using imaginary motherhood pain as a PR strategy? How does it feel knowing that media platforms that shape culture and politics never questioned it? And more importantly, what does it say when even your own mother can't support your version of the truth? This isn't about tabloid drama anymore. This is about credibility, about the fine line between vulnerability and performance, between truth and branding. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. Because if Meghan lied about this, what else has she lied about? The alleged racism in the royal family? The claims of suicidal ideation? The tearful moments in Oprah's garden? What if everything we thought was raw, real, and righteous was orchestrated? Because when you use trauma as currency, eventually, the receipts come due. And guess who might be holding them? Doria Ragland. She's not the kind of woman who runs to TMZ. She doesn't seek the spotlight. But according to our sources, she's kept everything. Messages, timelines, voicemails, emotional journal entries. All tucked away, all off the record. Until now. What changed? What pushed her to the edge? We'll get to that. Because this story isn't just about what Doria said. It's about what she saw, what she knew, and how long she was willing to keep it buried to protect her daughter's empire. But when the truth starts to eat at you from the inside, silence becomes its own kind of betrayal. And now, the silence has broken. In the chapters to come, we'll unpack everything. The inconsistencies in Meghan's story, the hidden timelines, the bizarre media omissions, the emotional collapse behind closed doors, the Hollywood PR machine that helped it all unfold, and Doria's shocking, emotional decision to finally put truth above loyalty. We'll trace every step of Meghan's narrative, from the floor of that Montecito nursery to the pages of the New York Times. And we'll ask the one question no one dared ask until now. Was there ever a baby at all? Because what comes next isn't just uncomfortable. It's catastrophic, and no one saw it coming. What does it take to transform a reputation? A single moment? A well-timed article? A public tragedy, perfectly told? Or maybe, just maybe, it takes the illusion of pain, strategically dropped into a world desperate for human connection. Let's go back to late 2020. The world was aching. Literally. We were mid-pandemic, isolated, grieving, emotionally fragile from too much bad news, too many lost loved ones, too much uncertainty. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, Meghan Markle appeared in the pages of the New York Times with an op-ed so personal, so devastating, it stunned even her critics into silence. The Losses We Share. That was the title. Understated, evocative, dignified. The words inside. Even more so. She spoke of waking up that July morning, tending to Archie's diaper, when a sudden sharp cramp brought her to the floor. She recalled feeling the loss in real time, holding her son as she knew she was losing another. It was harrowing, cinematic, but also suspiciously perfect. Because let's ask the real question. Who thinks like that, mid-crisis? Who reaches for metaphor, for polished prose, while bleeding in the bathroom? Who remembers with such vivid clarity, such lyrical timing, such public-ready language? Could it be that the story wasn't just remembered, but rehearsed? Now, don't get me wrong. Miscarriage is real, painful, private, and should never be used as clickbait. But that's exactly why this felt off. Because this didn't feel private. It felt produced. Let's look at the context. By November 2020, Meghan and Harry's narrative was spiraling. Their royal exit had backfired in the UK. American media had grown skeptical. Their attempts at launching a personal brand, via Archwell, had floundered. Their Spotify deal had stalled. Their Netflix content hadn't materialized. Their public goodwill was evaporating. And then suddenly, boom, an op-ed. A loss. A tragedy. A reclaiming of the narrative. Do you think that was coincidence? Because many don't. Especially not those who saw the exact language used in the piece. Let's break it down. Quote, "I knew, as I clutched my firstborn child, that I was losing my second." Pause. Read that again. That's not casual recollection. That's narrative engineering. It's the kind of line a novelist would write, not a grieving mother scribbling through tears. And it worked. Headlines flooded in. Meghan Markle's courage in sharing her miscarriage. The Duchess of Sussex humanizes the pain of pregnancy loss. Why Meghan's op-ed matters for women's health. The public softened. Celebrities reposted. Feminist icons applauded. Even those who'd been skeptical of the Sussexes began to lean in. Why? Because pain is the great equalizer. Because no one questions grief. And Meghan knew that. Or at least her PR team did. Because let's not forget, Meghan didn't just write this. She coordinated it. According to insiders at the New York Times, the piece wasn't pitched spontaneously. It was submitted through high-level intermediaries. Lawyers, PR consultants, branding experts. There was a rollout plan. Talking points for media outlets. Suggested headlines for social influencers. Even a list of supportive voices who were on standby to amplify the message. Does that sound raw to you? Or does it sound orchestrated? Now, let's go deeper. Why the New York Times? Think about it. Meghan had Instagram. She had Archwell. She had Oprah on speed dial. So why this outlet? And why that moment? Because the Times is serious. Global. Unquestioned. Publishing there gave her story the aura of truth. It wasn't a tabloid confessional. It wasn't a PR email blast. It was news. And with that move, Meghan accomplished what few celebrities ever manage. She hijacked a global trauma, pregnancy loss, and wrapped herself in it like armor. No one could criticize her now. Not after this. But some tried. And that's where it gets interesting. A few fringe bloggers, a handful of independent journalists, even a couple of women's health advocates whispered doubts. They noticed the lack of corroboration. No hospital cited. No doctor quoted. No medical facility named. No photo. No confirmation. No follow-up. Just a single article. One narrative. Told in one voice. And then silence. No interviews. No Q&As. No podcast conversations. Just a full stop. You'd think, given the platform and purpose of the op-ed, Meghan would have joined campaigns, partnered with pregnancy loss charities, hosted conversations about grief. But she didn't. Why? Was it emotional overwhelm? Or was there something else? Because here's where the contradiction cracks open. Days after the op-ed, Meghan was smiling on Zoom, filming campaign videos, promoting Archwell, talking about media literacy and kindness. Not a single mention of her miscarriage outside the confines of that one curated, edited article. Nothing spontaneous. Nothing unscripted. It was as if the pain had served its purpose and was quietly retired. And yet, the New York Times continued to leave the article unchallenged. Other outlets followed suit. No one dared probe deeper. Because again, who questions a grieving mother? But one person did, and that was Doria Ragland. Sources close to the family now claim that Doria was blindsided by the op-ed, that she read about the miscarriage at the same time the public did. Let that sink in. Her daughter, allegedly pregnant, allegedly miscarrying, allegedly traumatized, and she didn't tell her mother. Not in July, not in August, not in September, not in October, not until it was printed in the New York Times. Doria's reaction? Confusion, then heartbreak, then suspicion. How could a woman who FaceTimed her daily never mention something so monumental? Was Meghan ashamed? Was she hiding? Or was there nothing to hide? One family friend said it plainly. Doria didn't believe it. She never saw Meghan pregnant. She never heard about a miscarriage. And she felt used. Used. That's the word that keeps surfacing. Used for optics. For narrative control. For emotional currency. Because think about it. What better way to reset public perception than to become the victim? And what better victimhood than a mother mourning a child? It's chilling. Calculated. Cold. But if it worked, it worked. And the public never questioned it. Until now. Because now, the whispers are turning into roars. The timeline inconsistencies are growing. The Doria silence is cracking. The brand is wobbling. And in the center of it all sits that single, powerful, poetic sentence. I knew, as I clutched my firstborn child, that I was losing my second. What if that sentence is fiction? What if it's the line that unraveled everything? Because Doria wasn't the only one who noticed the cracks. Others did too, especially those closest to the Montecito household. People who came and went, who cleaned the rooms, managed the schedules, organized the cars. They noticed something strange in the summer of 2020. No medical emergencies, no canceled events, no abnormal routines. In fact, everything about that July looked normal. And that's where we go next. Because behind Meghan's crafted narrative, behind that op-ed, was a world of quiet observers. People who saw what happened, and more importantly, what didn't happen. And when they started talking, the whole illusion began to fall apart. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What kind of mother goes silent during her daughter's greatest moment of grief? What kind of grandmother stands still while the world grieves a grandchild she never got to hold? Better yet, what kind of silence speaks louder than 1,000 headlines? Because in the aftermath of Meghan Markle's explosive op-ed, as the world wrapped her in compassion, one person vanished from view. Not the tabloids, not the palace, not even Prince Harry. It was Doria Ragland. The one woman who should have been front and center in support said nothing. She didn't release a statement. She didn't sit beside Meghan in a follow-up interview. She didn't post an Instagram quote about loss, or light a candle, or even attend any public event linked to the supposed tragedy. She just disappeared. And that disappearance didn't go unnoticed. Let's rewind the footage. During Meghan's pregnancy with Archie, Doria was everywhere, beaming at Windsor Castle, smiling softly in Archie's first baby photos, hovering like a warm presence in the background of royal documentaries. She was Meghan's anchor. So why, in the moment of Meghan's most intimate devastation, was she nowhere to be found? Something was off. The tabloids didn't ask. The mainstream media didn't touch it. But the internet did. Quietly, forums lit up. People began connecting dots. Where was Doria? And more importantly, why wasn't Meghan mentioning her? Think about it. In the New York Times op-ed, Meghan described the alleged miscarriage in intimate, painful detail. She spoke of her husband, of the nurse's cold white walls, of loss, of healing. But not once did she mention her mother. Not once. Not in passing. Not in tribute. Not in reflection. Nothing. Isn't that strange? In the deepest moments of grief, most women seek the comfort of their mothers. And Doria had always been painted as a loving, present, nurturing figure. The woman who raised Meghan alone. The single mom who braved British tabloids with quiet dignity. So why was she completely missing from the emotional aftermath? Let's take it further. In late 2020, Meghan and Harry were spending almost every day in Montecito. Their inner circle was small, tight-knit, carefully curated. Doria lived 90 minutes away in Los Angeles. Do you really believe that a woman who allegedly lost a pregnancy in July, then wrote about it in November, wouldn't have her own mother come to support her? Wouldn't Meghan, of all people, be eager to include Doria in that chapter? Or was that exactly the point? Because now we know, from sources close to Doria, that she wasn't just uninvolved. She was excluded. Deliberately. Allegedly. Doria found out about the miscarriage when the rest of the world did. On the morning of November 25, 2020, when the New York Times piece hit digital shelves. One insider claims Doria called Meghan in tears, asking, "Why didn't you tell me?" And Meghan's response? According to that same source, "I didn't want to make you worry." But Doria didn't buy it. Because mothers know. They know when their child is hiding something. They know when the truth has been twisted. They feel it. In their bones, in their gut, in the aching silence between phone calls. And what Doria felt was betrayal. Let's sit with that. Not anger. Not hurt. Betrayal. Because Doria had stood by Meghan through everything. The racist headlines. The palace drama. The royal wedding. The Megxit fallout. The lawsuits. The Oprah interview. She was always there. Quietly. Loyally. Until now. And that's when she began to pull away. Sources say the distance didn't happen overnight. It began subtly. Fewer visits. Shorter calls. Less eye contact when they did meet. But emotionally, the fracture was instant. Because if Meghan could lie about something so intimate, If she could write it for the world before even telling her mother, then what else was she capable of? Here's where it gets more complicated. After the op-ed, Meghan's media team ramped up appearances. She was back on Zoom, back in charity circuits, promoting Archewell, pitching content, launching women-focused initiatives. And still, no Doria. She wasn't in the background of any calls. She wasn't thanked in any posts. She wasn't even mentioned on Mother's Day 2021. Nothing. Now compare that to Meghan's treatment of her late friend, Michelle Obama. She name-checked her, quoted her, referenced her as a mentor during that same time period. But her own mother? Radio silence. Why? Well, a different source, this time from Doria's inner yoga circle, says Doria had grown spiritually conflicted over the direction Meghan's brand was heading. Doria felt Meghan was weaponizing victimhood, the source said, and she didn't want to be part of that energy. Read that again. Weaponizing victimhood. That's not just criticism. That's a spiritual line in the sand. Doria's community is steeped in wellness, intention, truth-telling. They're not into public performance. They believe in authenticity, even when it's messy. And according to this source, Doria believed Meghan had crossed that line, especially with the miscarriage. Because it wasn't just the story. It was the use of the story, the silence afterward, the refusal to engage with miscarriage charities, the immediate pivot into brand launches and media tours. To Doria, it felt like the loss had been borrowed, not lived. And that's when she began to retreat. More yoga, more privacy, more time with spiritual counselors, less involvement with Meghan's world. But what happened when Meghan noticed? You'd expect confrontation. But no. According to insiders, Meghan didn't fight it. She distanced herself too. Meghan was offended that her mother didn't post about the op-ed, one former staffer alleged. She felt it was disloyal. Like Doria was choosing the tabloids over her. Let that irony marinate. Meghan, who told the world she was isolated and unsupported, cut off the one person who'd always supported her for not clapping loud enough. That's not grief. That's narrative management. And it gets darker. Because in early 2021, right before the Oprah interview, Doria was reportedly asked to appear, briefly, silently, supportively. Just a few words. A walk-on role. Something to say. I'm still here. She refused. Not angrily. Just quietly. She didn't want to lie. And Meghan was livid. The Oprah producers adjusted. Doria was cut from the plan. The show moved forward. And again, the world didn't question her absence. But behind the scenes, that was the final straw. Meghan stopped returning calls. Doria stopped trying. The mother-daughter bond? Frozen. And here's the truly chilling part. During that time, amid PR deals, book drafts, and press appearances, Doria started keeping things. Notes, emails, texts, screenshots. Not to expose Meghan, but to protect herself. Because if you know the truth, and the lie is growing bigger every day, what else can you do? She didn't leak. She didn't gossip. She simply prepared. Because the day might come, she feared, when silence wouldn't protect her anymore. And that day was closer than anyone thought. Because soon, people around Montecito started asking questions. Staff, neighbors, former employees. Even a nurse who used to do weekly check-ins at a nearby facility was overheard saying, "I never saw anything about a pregnancy. Not once." Things were unraveling. And Doria knew it. But she still said nothing. Until the day Meghan did something that forced her hand. Something calculated. Something public. And something Doria could no longer stay silent about. But what she did next would shake Meghan's carefully constructed world to its core. And it all started with a phone call. One Meghan never expected. What if the most watched interview of the decade was built on omission? What if the truth wasn't what was said, but what was strategically left out? Because here's the twist. Meghan Markle's now infamous sit-down with Oprah Winfrey, watched by over 17 million people in the US alone, was supposed to be her defining moment of truth. Raw, unfiltered, explosive. But in reality, it was a performance. And behind the carefully lit gardens of Tyler Perry's estate, behind the tears, the gasps, the side eyes, and the perfectly timed silences, sat one glaring, inexplicable absence. There was no mention of the miscarriage. Nothing. Not even a passing reference to the emotional op-ed she had written just a few months earlier. Let that sink in. In an interview designed to unpack everything. in a setting engineered to feel confessional, safe, and historic. Meghan Markle never once brought up the very story that had won her universal sympathy just 3 months prior. Why? Think about it. This was the moment the world tuned in, popcorn in hand, to watch Meghan confront the palace, the press, and the pain she claimed nearly ended her life. She spoke about racism. She spoke about suicidal thoughts. She spoke about Archie's skin color, Kate Middleton, and even security protocols. But not about losing a child. Not about the darkest personal grief a woman can endure. Not about the op-ed that had touched millions. Why? It's not like Oprah would have avoided the topic. She was there to get it all. But rumor has it, she wasn't allowed. Let's break this down. Before that March 2021 interview aired, Oprah's team had done their research. They'd reviewed Meghan's NYT piece. They prepared follow-ups. They wanted to show the emotional cost of royal rejection. The miscarriage, from a storytelling perspective, was a goldmine. But insiders say Meghan specifically asked for it to be left out. Why? Here's where things get dicey. According to one behind-the-scenes source, Meghan's team was worried that digging into the miscarriage story on camera would risk scrutiny. Why? Because Oprah doesn't do fluff. She digs. And if she had asked even one follow-up question, what hospital? Who was there? Did you get medical treatment? The entire facade could have cracked. The more you poke a scripted narrative, the more it starts to leak. So instead of risking it, Meghan's team allegedly told producers, stay off the topic. Oprah agreed. After all, the racism angle was already powerful. The "Kate made me cry" line was juicy. There was plenty of drama without risking a collapse of the one narrative Meghan couldn't afford to defend live. But Doria noticed. She watched the interview. Alone. Silent. Observant. And that phone call? That was the moment she realized her daughter had buried the miscarriage for real. Not because she was too emotional, but because the story wasn't airtight. And suddenly, it all made sense. The missing hospital records, the lack of a support system, the instant pivot to press tours, the media blitz without a single charity partnership for pregnancy loss. It wasn't grief. It was strategy. And Doria felt sick. Because now, she wasn't just excluded from a lie. She was complicit by association. You see, in the months following the op-ed, Doria's image had been quietly inserted into Meghan's public story. She didn't speak, but she was always referenced as the calming influence, the inspiration, the yoga mother behind Meghan's resilience. And in silence, the world assumed she knew everything, that she had been there, that she had cried, that she had held her daughter's hand through the pain. But she hadn't. And now, watching Oprah unfold on screen, realizing the one story that should have been central had been erased like it never happened, Doria understood the game. Meghan wasn't living her truth. She was scripting it. And Doria? She was a character in that script, played when convenient, discarded when disruptive. Now, imagine being a mother, watching the world rally behind your child for a tragedy you know may not have happened at all. What do? Do you stay silent? Do you protect her? Or do you start to keep records? According to one close confidant, Doria began journaling religiously after the Oprah interview. Daily reflections. Emotional truths. A mother's way of preserving what little she had left, her version of reality. Because when the camera lights dimmed and the audience logged off, Doria still had to live with the gnawing suspicion. Was any of it true? Let's return to the Oprah footage. Pay attention to the subtle cues. Watch Meghan's body language when discussing pain. She leans in. Eyes widen. Breath quickens. But when Oprah brings up healing, there's a shift. A sudden emotional wall. A pivot to Archwell. A nod to Harry. A safe subject. No reflection on the loss she had allegedly suffered less than 9 months earlier. It's almost as if she forgot. And viewers noticed. Reddit threads lit up with questions. Twitter users asked, why no mention of the miscarriage? Still, mainstream media stayed quiet. Too risky. Too sensitive. Too sacred. But that's the problem, isn't it? We've reached a point where some stories become untouchable, even when they beg for clarity, even when they don't add up. And that's where Doria's quiet fury began to boil. Because if the truth was buried under press strategy, if the public had been emotionally manipulated, if she, the mother, was used to sell a tragedy she never experienced, then silence was no longer dignity. It was complicity. And she couldn't live with that anymore. Now, to be clear, Doria didn't storm into the media. She didn't call TMZ or drop a tell-all. She did something far more dangerous. She confided in the wrong person. Someone she trusted. Someone who took notes. And someone who began whispering to the right ears. That's when the illusion began to crack. A quiet tip here. A murmured doubt there. Until one journalist started digging. And what they found behind the Oprah footage. Behind the scripts, behind the press statements, was a timeline riddled with holes. Medical records that didn't exist. Security footage that didn't show hospital visits. Staff schedules with no interruptions. And a mother who couldn't recall a single moment of her daughter grieving a pregnancy she never knew about. It was all too clean, too curated, too convenient. And as that journalist got closer to the truth, something happened. Their access was revoked. Their interviews canceled. Their emails went unanswered. Because Meghan's team had gotten wind of the leak. And they were terrified. Not because of what Oprah had asked, but because of what she didn't. The miscarriage wasn't just a lie they told the public. It was a narrative they buried in plain sight. And when you hide something in plain sight, eventually, someone notices. Doria noticed. And what she did next would make sure the world couldn't ignore it anymore. Because she was done being a prop. Done being a shield. Done being silent. And the next move she made? It didn't just risk everything Meghan built. It risked exposing the entire machinery behind the Markle illusion. They were hired quietly, trained meticulously, and dismissed without a word. The Montecito staffers, housekeepers, nannies, assistants, security personnel were supposed to be invisible, professional, forgettable, but they weren't. Because the people closest to the lie are often the ones paid to keep it. And what they saw inside Meghan and Harry's $14 million Montecito mansion in the summer of 2020 might be the most damning evidence, yet that the miscarriage story wasn't just suspicious. It was manufactured. Let's back up. When Meghan published her New York Times op-ed in November 2020, she painted an emotional picture. A woman cradling her toddler, falling to the floor in pain. The sterile white walls of a hospital. The numbness of grief. The slow climb back to healing. It was vivid, gut-wrenching, unforgettable, but to the people inside that house, none of it happened. At least, not the way she described it. And one by one, they started disappearing. Let's introduce one of them. We'll call her Erin. Not her real name, but her story has been cross-verified by 2 sources, including someone who worked under her. Erin was hired in May 2020 as a part-time estate manager and household coordinator. A fancy title for someone who knew everything. Who came, who left, what deliveries arrived, which calls were made, and what staff rotations were scheduled. And according to Erin, there was no indication of a pregnancy in July. No doctors, no nurses, no emergency calls, no blood, no ambulance, nothing. It was a normal week, she reportedly told a friend 6 months later. We were planning a landscaping remodel. There were meetings with a lighting designer. Meghan was filming some virtual segments and prepping for a photo shoot. She didn't even cancel anything. Now, ask yourself, does that sound like a woman who just lost a child? And Erin wasn't the only one. Several staffers in Montecito. Some employed directly by Meghan and Harry, others outsourced through private agencies, have since echoed similar claims. 1 chef, 2 housekeepers, a night security shift member, a temporary nanny. All of them, gone by the end of 2020. Quiet terminations. No legal fuss. But sources say they were all asked to sign stricter than usual NDAs upon exit. Not just confidentiality clauses, but non-disclosure, non-disparagement, and digital silence agreements. Standard procedure? Maybe. But the timing was suspicious, because most of them were let go between July and October 2020, right before the op-ed dropped. Now let's talk about Alma. Again, not her real name. But Alma was assigned as a rotating childcare aide that summer, brought in during Meghan's lighter work weeks to help with Archie. According to 2 separate interviews, Alma never once witnessed a miscarriage event. No late-night emergency. No sudden collapse. No emotional breakdown. She seemed stressed, sure, Alma reportedly said. But it wasn't grief. It was work stress, campaign stuff, brand meetings. And here's where it gets unsettling. Alma was told, directly by a senior staff member, not to speak to Meghan unless spoken to. Why? Because Meghan, they said, was method writing. She was in a vulnerable, focused headspace. That's not uncommon for celebrities prepping major campaigns. But for someone supposedly grieving the loss of a baby? Odd. Especially considering Meghan was conducting Zoom calls, reviewing design pitches, and taking part in brand consultations during that same period. What about Prince Harry? Shouldn't he have been spiraling with grief? But he wasn't. Multiple staff members recall Harry being upbeat, engaged, and active that summer, riding his bike through Montecito, playing with Archie in the yard, chatting with the team about ideas for their foundation. Not the image of a man grappling with personal devastation. And when the op-ed hit, it shocked many of them, because nothing in their direct environment reflected what was described. And then, the staff began vanishing. One by one, contracts not renewed, schedules reshuffled, access codes revoked. And here's the kicker, some weren't even fired for cause. They were simply let go during a supposed restructuring of the household. No explanations, just silence. But one staff member, someone who had been there since 2019, left on her own terms. We'll call her Nadine. Nadine was a personal assistant, hired back when Meghan and Harry first moved to California. She was part of the original core, trusted, protected, and she walked out. Why? Because she said something she wasn't supposed to. According to a source, Nadine asked, gently, privately, if Meghan was okay. She'd read the op-ed, felt concern, wanted to offer sympathy. Meghan's response? Cold, dismissive. I don't talk about that, she reportedly snapped. Let's stay on task. That was the last time Nadine spoke to her directly. 2 weeks later, she handed in her resignation. And what she told her agency afterward? She was lying. Or at the very least, exaggerating. Because Nadine had access. She saw Meghan's calendar, her routines, her deliveries, her call logs. And nowhere in any of it was grief. There were no doctor follow-ups, no post-op care, no prescriptions, no signs of trauma. Just schedules, strategy, and a building media rollout plan. Let's pause here. You may be thinking, people grieve differently. Some do so quietly. Some stay productive to cope. Fair point. But that's not what this is about. This isn't about how Meghan handled the miscarriage. It's about whether it even happened at all. And the staff who were there, the people who cooked her meals, cleaned her sheets, walked her dog, scheduled her meetings, they all say the same thing. There was no sign. Nothing. Zero. And when a tragedy that public leaves no private trace, that's a red flag. Because trauma leaves fingerprints. Even if only emotional ones. Even if only in the form of a messy kitchen, a tearful conversation, a canceled call. But there was nothing. Just silence. And firings. And NDAs. All tightly wrapped in a smiling PR bow that read, empathy. Now, not all staffers have spoken. Some are still bound by legal threats. Others are afraid. But a few, especially those let go before signing anything, have begun whispering again. And one of them says Doria called her. Yes, Doria. Privately. Quietly. Months after the op-ed. Why? To ask a simple question. Did you see anything? And when the answer came, no, ma'am. Nothing happened. Doria didn't sound surprised. She sounded sad. That's when the final piece of this chapter locks into place. Because it means Doria wasn't just silently withdrawing. She was investigating, asking around, collecting stories, cross-checking the version of events her daughter told the world against the truth that had unfolded in her own home. She was looking for confirmation, or closure, or maybe just one person who could say, yes, I was there. But no one could. Not a single person in that house could verify the story Meghan told. And that left Doria with a decision to make. Keep protecting the illusion, or speak. And what she chose next would unravel more than just a lie. It would pull apart the entire image of Montecito as a sanctuary. Because behind those white walls and lush green lawns, something was rotting, and it was about to be exposed. Where's the proof? That's the question echoing louder with every passing day. Because when you strip away the poetic prose, the PR playbook, and the palace-sized drama, what's left? Cold, hard, evidence. Or in Meghan Markle's case, the mysterious lack of it. Let's get clinical. In July 2020, Meghan claimed she suffered a miscarriage while changing Archie's diaper. She described a sudden, sharp cramp, a fall to the floor, a heart-wrenching realization that she was losing her second child. And yet, there is no trace of it in the medical system. No ambulance was called. No hospital log shows her name. No private OBGYN in Montecito has record of seeing her. No post-miscarriage care was scheduled. Nothing. And we know this, not from speculation, but from a growing collection of hospital insiders, clinic staff, and health administrators who were quietly approached months after the op-ed dropped. Not by journalists. By Doria. That's right, Doria Ragland, disturbed by the absence of personal involvement in the alleged tragedy, began reaching out to professionals discreetly. She didn't want to make a scene. She wasn't launching an expose. She was a mother, trying to find the truth, trying to confirm whether her daughter's story could be substantiated, even if she herself had been left out of it. And the answer she got? Alarming. Let's start with the basics. There are only a handful of high-end private medical facilities in the Montecito-Santa Barbara area that Meghan would have likely used. Cedars-Sinai isn't nearby, and Meghan, being ultra-conscious of privacy, was believed to be receiving care through boutique women's clinics and private home visits. So when Doria discreetly asked a contact at the Serenity Women's Wellness Center, one of the top private maternal care facilities in Santa Barbara, if Meghan had been seen there in July 2020, the answer was clear. No record, no visit, no emergency call-out, nothing. Same at two other locations. One midwife service, one luxury private OB concierge clinic. Nothing. But Doria didn't stop there. She also quietly contacted a nurse who had previously worked part-time with the Sussexes during Archie's first months. Let's call her Janelle. Doria asked, "Did Meghan call you? Did anything happen?" Janelle's reply? She never mentioned being pregnant. Not once. Not in July. Not before. I thought they were waiting a while before trying again. And that tracks. Because in the months leading up to July 2020, Meghan was heavily involved in launching Archewell. She was doing virtual engagements, recording campaign videos, holding internal meetings. All signs pointed to a woman focused on brand building, not morning sickness. Still, people can be private, right? Maybe she didn't want anyone to know. Maybe she miscarried very early on and chose not to involve family. Let's explore that angle. Even in early miscarriages, especially for high-profile individuals, there are still typical procedures. Confirming via scan. Follow-up appointments. D&C procedures if the miscarriage doesn't complete naturally. Emotional counseling referrals. But none of those happened. At least not in any verifiable way. And here's where it gets even more suspicious. Several legal experts who've reviewed the New York Times editorial have pointed out something strange: the phrasing. Meghan never explicitly says she miscarried. She describes symptoms. She implies loss. She paints emotional devastation. But the entire essay avoids medical confirmation. That's not accidental. That's legalese. It's PR sanitized vulnerability, designed to invite empathy without risking liability. And when you couple that with the zero evidence trail, the silence from family, and the absence of even the simplest medical breadcrumbs, it paints a chilling picture. Now, Doria, armed with these quiet revelations, reportedly confronted Meghan. Not publicly, not with rage, with heartbreak. Sources say the conversation began with a simple question. "Where did you go that day?" And Meghan didn't answer. Instead, she allegedly deflected, claimed Doria was buying into the noise, accused her of being unsupportive. But when pressed, when asked for the name of the doctor, the location, anything, Meghan changed the subject. She went cold, emotionless, and Doria, devastated, left the house in silence. That was the last time they spoke face-to-face in 2020. Now let's consider the security angle. Harry and Meghan's team are known for tight protection. Their Montecito compound is under 24/7 surveillance. Visitors are logged. Medical staff are screened. Deliveries are monitored. So if Meghan did suffer a miscarriage in July 2020, there would be a security record of someone entering or leaving in a medical capacity. But again, nothing. A former security advisor, who left the team in late 2020, reportedly confirmed there was no emergency dispatch during that period. No unplanned medical access. No overnight clinic visits. No heightened alerts. Just the usual rotations. In fact, during the exact week Meghan claimed she miscarried, staff logs show multiple branding and charity planning meetings, via Zoom and in person. One even involved a photographer being brought onto the property for a concept shoot. Do you believe a woman recovering from a miscarriage would greenlight a photo shoot? More importantly, Would she feel compelled to write about that moment for global publication 4 months later, while still refusing to share the basic details with her mother? Or was it never about grieving? Was it about narrative control? Because by the time the op-ed dropped, Meghan had everything to gain from a sympathy surge. She was repositioning herself from royal villain to global voice for women. She was finalizing her Netflix and Spotify deals. She needed credibility in a culture driven by personal trauma. And what better story than the loss of a child? But unlike other public figures who share miscarriage stories, Chrissy Teigen, Beyoncé, Michelle Obama, there were no photos, no ultrasound, no doctor's note, no timeline, just a feeling, written into a newspaper, sanitized, scripted, strategic. And if that wasn't enough to raise suspicions, consider this. In the same month Meghan claimed to have miscarried, she was reportedly reviewing final edits for a children's book she would later release, The Bench. Yes, a children's book about fatherhood, inspired by Harry and Archie. The exact kind of book a grieving mother might delay, postpone, shelve indefinitely. But not Meghan. She was already planning the next chapter of the brand. And Doria saw it. She saw her daughter moving on like nothing had happened. And in private, she wept. Because if it was true, if Meghan had miscarried, then Doria had been shut out of the most painful moment of her child's life. But if it wasn't true, if it had been a fabricated trauma, crafted for public manipulation, then Doria had just witnessed her daughter become the very thing she once protected her from. A performer, a deceiver, a woman who used tragedy to build a brand. And that realization shattered her. Because now, Doria had no choice. She couldn't verify the medical facts. She couldn't produce receipts. But she could tell the truth. And the first time she whispered that truth to someone close, the ripple effect began. Because the lie wasn't just emotional. It was clinical. And the more people Doria spoke to, the more people she quietly asked for help, the more clear it became. There was no baby. There was no loss. There was no July miscarriage. Only a story. And that story was about to collapse. But the real twist? It wasn't Meghan who would break under the weight of it. It was someone far more unexpected. Because when Meghan pushed the narrative too far, when she used the miscarriage as the centerpiece for a new women's initiative she planned to launch in 2021, someone else finally stood up. Someone who'd been quiet, watching, taking notes. And when they came forward, everything changed. Because their testimony didn't just poke holes in the story. It detonated it. What if there was no baby? Not just no miscarriage, but no pregnancy at all. No second child lost. No swelling belly in secret. No heartbeat ever heard. Just a script. A page in the story of Meghan Markle's carefully curated public rebirth. A chapter designed not to grieve, but to galvanize. And for Doria Ragland, the one person who should have known above all others, it was the moment her daughter's image split from reality entirely. The lie had become too big, too polished, too profitable. And it was about to fall apart. Let's rewind to early 2020, before the world shut down, before Harry and Meghan left the royal family in a storm of interviews, headlines, and half-truths. Back then, behind the scenes, Meghan was in planning mode. She wasn't just escaping the firm. She was building something bigger, a brand, a narrative, a public identity that could eclipse the royal spotlight and make her untouchable. But there was a problem. Meghan and Harry were rapidly losing sympathy. The British public had turned cold. American networks were skeptical. The Megxit controversy had painted her not as a victim, but a schemer. She needed a reset. And what better way to do that than to become the face of female pain, of maternal grief, of silent suffering? Of course, that would require a story, a humanizing one, a headline, a hook. And by the summer of 2020, whispers had begun that Meghan was planning to share something deeply personal with the world. But there was no bump. No prenatal vitamins. No restricted movement. No "we're expecting again" clues dropped into interviews. No glow. Not even a closed-door conversation with Doria about a second child. And Doria knew. Because a mother always knows. She saw Meghan almost weekly back then. They were close, until they weren't. And never once, not once, did Meghan say the words, "I'm pregnant." So when the op-ed landed on November 25th, Doria's stomach dropped. Because not only had she not been told, she hadn't even suspected. It was like reading about a stranger. Now let's talk about the op-ed again, but from a different lens. What if you read it not as a mother's account of trauma, but as a calculated performance? What stands out? The precision, the rhetorical flourishes, the emotive language woven with political undertones. This wasn't just about grief. It was about positioning, and Meghan's team knew exactly what they were doing. Because just weeks earlier, her Archwell Foundation had quietly filed new initiatives under the category of women's wellness, mental health, and trauma response. The op-ed wasn't the end of a tragedy. It was the launchpad. But something went wrong. Someone close to Meghan's team, an ex-communication strategist who we'll call Bryce, allegedly became uneasy. Bryce had worked with high-profile women's advocacy organizations before. He understood the gravity of miscarriage narratives. He knew how sacred that space was to real survivors. And according to a close associate, Bryce was one of the few who asked the obvious question during internal strategy sessions. Are we sure this happened? The room went silent. A senior advisor allegedly responded, "That's above your pay grade." Another added, "We're not here to verify trauma. We're here to protect the message." And that was the moment Bryce knew. It was all a show. And worse, it was a show using borrowed pain. Bryce quietly resigned weeks later. But before he left, he compiled a private archive, emails, texts, drafts of press materials. Why? Not out of revenge. Out of fear. Because when you help spin a story that powerful and you don't know if it's real, you become a liability. And if the truth ever gets out, you better have receipts. Fast forward to spring 2021. Bryce meets a former Archwell contractor for drinks. He mentions the op-ed, says he's still uneasy. The contractor leans in. And what she allegedly says next sends a chill through him. You know, there was a version where she was supposed to show the ultrasound. Wait, what? An ultrasound? A fabricated one? The contractor shrugs. I don't think it ever existed, she says. That whole narrative changed last minute. Too risky. Too risky. That's the phrase that keeps circling the drain. Because somewhere along the way, someone realized the best lie is one that feels true, but can't be disproved. No dates. No doctors. No photos. Just emotion. And no one questions emotion. Especially not from a woman, in a world that silences women. Meghan had cracked the formula. Tell a story just vague enough to be unprovable, just raw enough to be untouchable. And it worked. Until Doria started comparing timelines. She remembered that July. It was the same month Meghan launched a quiet press outreach with Michelle Obama's team. Same month she had meetings with branding experts in LA. Same month she told Doria, "I'm feeling clear, focused, rebuilding." Not once did she say, "I'm heartbroken," or even, "I was expecting." And the more Doria thought about it, the more one word haunted her. Surrogacy. Because it wasn't the first time the topic had floated around. Especially not in Meghan's circles. Especially not after the whispers surrounding Lilibet's birth in 2021. Yes, that's right. Let's go there. Because some believe the miscarriage narrative was not just about the past. It was about setting up the future. What if Meghan and Harry already knew they'd use a surrogate? What if they feared backlash for not naturally giving birth? What if the 2020 op-ed wasn't a confession, but a preemptive explanation? Lose a child in secret. Grieve it publicly. Then when the next one arrives by surrogacy, the public nods with compassion instead of suspicion. Of course she used a surrogate, they'd say. After what she went through, who could blame her? It's dark. It's manipulative. But it's brilliant PR. And it's exactly the kind of story arc that Hollywood lives for. Pain, redemption, new life. But it required one thing. That people believe the baby ever existed. And that's where the whole thing unravels. Because as Doria kept digging, and as Bryce's collection of documents found their way into more hands, the pattern became undeniable. There was no baby, no announcement, no doctor, no early scan, no confirmation, just a line in a paragraph. In an op-ed, in a global paper, wrapped in tragedy. And from that, an empire was rebuilt. Archwell rebranded itself around empathy. The Spotify deals picked up steam. Netflix greenlit a documentary. Meghan was now not just a duchess, but a survivor, a symbol, a brand. But to Doria, she was still a daughter. And the woman Doria raised, however ambitious, however driven, wouldn't fake something like this. Unless something had changed. Unless the ambition had devoured the girl she once knew. And when Doria confronted her one final time, the The silence was telling. There was no outrage, no denial, just a blank stare, a pause, and a single sentence. "You wouldn't understand, Mom." That was it. That was the last conversation they had about the miscarriage, about the pregnancy, about the baby that wasn't. And in that moment, Doria realized the daughter she thought she knew was gone, replaced by a woman chasing legacy at any cost, even if it meant borrowing pain she never felt. Even if it meant rewriting her own mother's silence into complicity, even if it meant lying to the world. And what Doria did next would shake the very foundation of Meghan's empire, because the baby that wasn't had become the crack in the facade, and Doria was no longer willing to plaster over it, because someone, finally, had to tell the truth. What happens when a mother realizes her silence has become a weapon used against her? What happens when love becomes a muzzle? When the daughter you raised turns your quiet dignity into evidence of agreement. That's what happened to Doria Ragland. And by the time she realized it, she was already trapped in a narrative she never wrote. Let's be blunt. Doria didn't want to expose Meghan. She didn't want this story told. For years, she kept her head down, smiled for the cameras, bit her tongue when tabloids spun their tales. She endured whispers, racism, invasion of privacy, all for her daughter. She was the loyal one, the unproblematic one, the soft-spoken one in sandals and linen dresses, who raised Meghan single-handedly and was always framed as the grounding, earthy counterbalance to her daughter's Hollywood shine. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Doria was being slowly, expertly gaslighted. Not by the media, not by the palace, by Meghan. And it all started when Doria began asking questions. Real questions. Were you ever pregnant? Why didn't you tell me? Why is there no doctor's name? Why can't you just show me something, anything? And Meghan, according to multiple sources close to the family, didn't answer. At least not directly. She changed the subject. She got defensive. She spun Doria's concern into an accusation. Said things like, "I needed space. I didn't want judgment. You wouldn't have believed me anyway. This is why I didn't say anything. You're too focused on what's real instead of what matters." Wait. Stop. What's real instead of what matters? That's the line that allegedly broke Doria. Because it wasn't just deflection. It was manipulation. Subtle, cruel, effective. Suddenly, Doria's entirely reasonable concerns were twisted into personal failings. She wasn't empathetic enough. She didn't understand trauma. She wasn't evolved enough to comprehend symbolic truth. Sound familiar? It's the same narrative Meghan's used in public. Redefining reality as perception. Redefining authenticity as optics. And when applied to the world, it's brand strategy. But when applied to your own mother, it's gaslighting. Let's rewind. After the Oprah interview aired, and Meghan made no mention of the miscarriage, Doria was confused, stunned, then suspicious. Because if the loss was real, why erase it? Why make it a centerpiece in the New York Times, but not a footnote in the biggest interview of your life? Doria began connecting dots. Private moments. Inconsistencies. The coolness after the op-ed dropped. The way Meghan flinched when Doria asked gentle follow-up questions. And then came the worst moment of all. According to a longtime family friend, Doria finally asked Meghan over dinner, "Was there ever a second baby?" The table went quiet. Harry reportedly looked down, and Meghan, stone-faced, replied, "Why are you doing this?" No denial, no tears, no anger, just that. Why are you doing this? As if Doria was the one breaking trust. As if she were the villain in this fairy tale. Let's stop and really think about that. This woman carried Meghan in her belly, raised her alone, survived financial hardship, racism, isolation. She stood by her through every reinvention, actress, activist, duchess, exile. And now, because she asked for clarity, she was being cast as disloyal. That's not just gaslighting. That's emotional terrorism. And Doria felt it. In her bones. In her gut. In her chest. She went home that night and cried. Not out of betrayal, but heartbreak. Because if Meghan had lied about something so intimate, so sacred, and knew Doria didn't believe her, but kept using her image in the press to suggest otherwise, then Doria wasn't just being silenced. She was being exploited. Let's talk about that image for a second. Think back to every article praising Meghan's maternal lineage. Every Oprah soundbite suggesting her strength came from her stoic, spiritual mother. The press photos of Doria holding Archie. The silent nods to 3 generations of powerful women. All of it curated. Doria's absence of objection was treated as endorsement. And Meghan knew it. She used it, weaponized it. Because in the public eye, Doria was the proof. If Meghan's own mother wasn't contradicting her, then it had to be true, right? But Doria wasn't silent because it was true. She was silent because she was afraid. Afraid of damaging Meghan's carefully constructed life. Afraid of being torn apart in the press. Afraid of the one thing no mother ever wants to admit, that her child might be lying to millions and expect her to play along. It got worse. According to a spiritual advisor who's worked with Doria for years, she began to suffer from chronic anxiety in late 2021. Sleep issues, hair loss, digestive problems. Why? Because secrets eat you alive. Especially when the secret is a lie you didn't tell, but were forced to wear. And the final straw? It came when Meghan began quietly pitching a new Archewell initiative in early 2022, one centered on reproductive trauma and female resilience. The pitch decks were vague, but the intention was clear. Use the op-ed as the foundation. Build programming around it. Workshops, brand partnerships, media content. An empire built on a loss that never happened. And Doria snapped. According to one person close to her, she said, "This isn't healing. This is performance. And I won't be part of it." She refused to attend meetings. She distanced herself from Archewell. She stopped responding to Meghan's team. And for the first time in years, Doria considered speaking. Not because she wanted fame, but because the silence had become betrayal. To herself, to the truth, to every real mother who had suffered real loss, and been erased by a woman faking hers for influence. But Meghan saw it coming. And according to leaks from an inner circle member, she tried to pull Doria back in with one final pitch. "Mom, if you do this, you'll destroy me." Read that again. Not, "It's not true." Not, "Let me explain." But, "You'll destroy me." Because when you're running a house of cards, even a mother's breath can bring it all down. Doria didn't answer. She just hung up. That was the last time they spoke directly for months. And in that silence, Meghan moved forward. Booking events, planning new ventures, attending red carpets. But Doria? She began preparing, not for revenge, for release. Because the burden of a lie you didn't tell, but have to carry, is unbearable. And when Doria finally decided to speak, it wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It was a whisper, a conversation, a leak. But the person she whispered to, they had power. And they weren't loyal to Meghan. They were loyal to truth. And what they did with that truth would break open everything. Because the